We are going to an event that caused many aviation rules to change after it happened. The accident was very unlikely to happen. The story of Aloha Airlines 243, which includes the struggle for the lives of pilots, passengers, and cabin crew, is based on official accident reports and eyewitness accounts. On April 28, 1988, we are going to Hilo International Airport in Hawaii. At noon, this plane belonging to Aloha Airlines was preparing to go to Honolulu in Hawaii. The flight would be a very short flight of only 35 minutes in total. When we look at the company's operations, almost all of its flights consist of short flights. The pilots had been making these short flights between the islands since the early hours of the morning, and they were going to make their 9th routine flight that day, if everything went well. Let's take a short break from the video. We prepare for each video by working for days. You can support us by hitting the like button at the bottom to make the videos pop up. Now let's go back to the story of the Boeing 737 with 95 people on board. The airplane that was going to make the flight was a 19-year-old Boeing 737-200, one of the most popular airplanes of its time, which was built in 1969. The aircraft, tail number November 7, 3711, began operating under the umbrella of Aloha Airlines. 35,000 hours had been flown on the plane, which was not a high number for a passenger jet. However, since they were constantly flying short flights of half an hour and an hour in that region, the plane had made nearly 90,000 landings and takeoffs, which was a significant number. 95 people, including 90 passengers and 5 flight crew, completed their boarding for the flight. The pilots asked for reverse thrust and started to move to the runway. 44-year-old Captain Pilot Robert was sitting in the left seat of the plane. He was an experienced pilot with 8,500 hours of total flight experience, of which 6,700 hours were on Boeing 737s. He had been working for Aloha Airlines for 11 years. In the co-pilot seat was 36-year-old pilot Mimi, the first female pilot in the history of Aloha Airlines. She was also a highly experienced pilot with 3,500 hours of her 8,000 hours of flight experience on 737s. After 9 years of flying with Aloha Airlines, the female pilot was now waiting to be promoted to captain. The crew in the cabin was also very experienced. In the cabin was the cabin chief CB, who had been flying since the first jet engine airplanes were invented and had been working in the cabin for 37 years. There was also an air traffic controller sitting in the jump seat behind the pilots in the cockpit. In short, the passengers were in safe hands. The pilots completed their taxis within minutes, received permission from the tower to enter the runway and take off, and lined up at the runway. The pilots powered up both engines of the passenger jet and began to accelerate on the runway. When they reached takeoff speed at 1325, they made a slightly noisy and jerky takeoff. But this type of noise was not very different from what the pilots and the crew on board were used to, so no one noticed anything. One of the 90 passengers on board had noticed that the surface of the plane near where they were boarding was abraded when they boarded the plane. She had noticed a small crack in the fuselage of the plane and took his seat anxiously. When she saw that the cabin crew was relaxed, she did not tell the cabin crew. Also, strangely, another passenger, who was initially sitting in the front seat, felt uneasy and changed to one of the rear seats. Going back to the flight, the first officer Mimi was the pilot flying and the captain was the pilot monitoring. It would take 20 minutes for the pilots to reach their feet 7,300 meters since the flight was very short. The cabin attendants started to offer drinks to the passengers during the climbing phase. The pilots reached their cruising altitude of 24,000 feet and communicated with the Honolulu Center. The sky was clear and almost cloudless. Everything was proceeding as usual when suddenly a big explosion sounded. Then there was a cloud of flying objects and dust in the cabin. Everything inside the plane was trying to fly out because of the depressurized air. The crew in the cockpit immediately reached for their masks and started to take oxygen supplements. The captain started shouting that we were losing pressure. The pressurized air inside the plane was coming out because of the explosion in the fuselage. There was a tear in the part of the fuselage close to the pilots where the front passengers were. A 35 square meter piece of the fuselage was torn off by the explosion. The passengers in the front were shocked when they suddenly saw the blue sky. Fortunately, everyone on the plane was in their seats except the cabin crew. The passengers had not unbuckled their seatbelts because the climb phase had just been completed. One of the cabin crew, CB, an experienced supervisor who had been working for 37 years, was not seen in the cabin after the explosion. She was thrown out of the plane by the impact of the explosion. Other cabin crew members were knocked to the ground and injured. At that altitude and high speeds, strong winds were blowing into the plane. The captain shouted to his co-pilot that he was in control, but the pilots could not even hear each other because of the strong wind. The captain immediately initiated an emergency descent and opened the air brakes to slow down. The pilots could not hear each other and were trying to help each other with hand signals. The co-pilot connected the emergency code 7700 to the transponder to send an emergency signal. When the pilots turned behind them, they saw the sky. They realized there had been an explosion on the plane and the severity of the damage. Co-pilot Mimi called out to the air traffic controller to inform him of their situation and declare an emergency. She tried to tell him that they were going to land in Maui, which was closer to them, but the center could not hear them because of the strong wind. Although they could not hear the pilots, the controller at the Maui airport had received the emergency signal that the pilots had entered. They had entered the emergency code about 40 kilometers from the airport. At that altitude, there is not enough oxygen for the human body. The impact of the explosion had also damaged the tanks supplying oxygen to the passengers' oxygen masks. So even though the masks fell off, the passengers could not benefit from the oxygen. The passengers were dressed for the spring weather in Hawaii. The lack of oxygen could have caused them to go into hypoxia. Hypoxia is a problem that initially results in drunkenness and loss of consciousness in case of insufficient oxygen intake. It can lead to death in case of insufficient oxygen intake. They were losing 500 kilometers per hour and 1,200 meters per minute. The controller said the ambulance would be there. Fortunately, the pilots descended from 24,000 feet to 14,000 feet as soon as possible and brought the plane down to a level where oxygen would be sufficient. Since they no longer needed oxygen masks, the pilots removed their masks. Interestingly, after the explosion, the cockpit was tilted down 1 meter. The front of the plane was about 1 meter lower than the back of the plane, so the passengers could not see the pilots. The fuselage of the plane and the cockpit were held by beams on the floor. It was something like a miracle. The plane was bent in the middle but not broken, and most importantly, it was still flying. The cabin officer called the cockpit crew by phone to see if anyone was flying the plane, but the connection cables were broken and they could not communicate. The staff initially thought that the pilots were not flying the plane. The cabin crew approached the passengers one by one and asked if they could manage to fly the plane, but the only answer they could get from the helpless passengers was no. While the captain was descending, the co-pilot switched the radio frequency to the Maui tower frequency. The co-pilot had decided to try their luck here after getting no response from the Honolulu tower frequency. 3 minutes after the explosion, they managed to establish their first connection with the tower. The co-pilot gave the location information after several calls. She said they were descending rapidly from 13,000 feet and had lost pressure. She declared an emergency and requested emergency crews to be prepared at the airport. The controller responded that he understood and gave wind information. The co-pilot reconnected within seconds and said, "We will need help. We cannot communicate with the cabin crew. We will need help to evacuate the passengers." The controller said the ambulance would be there and it would be clear to land on runway 02. The controller then asked for the number of people on board and the amount of fuel on board, which was an emergency procedure. The pilots had now managed to slow down and get to the ideal altitude. When the captain pilot had slowed down enough, he retracted the air brakes. They had to make hard left and right maneuvers to get to Maui, where they were going to land. Their problem now was whether the damaged fuselage could withstand the stress during these maneuvers. The fuselage separating from the cockpit could have been the worst thing. At 210 knots, the wind noise had decreased and the pilots were able to communicate with each other. For a while, the tower did not receive any response from the pilots. He thought that the plane had crashed, but soon afterward, when he received a response from the pilots, he took a deep sigh of relief. The pilots lowered the flaps one level to make a more stable approach. The flaps increased the lift at low speeds, making it possible to descend and land at low speeds. After the first level of flaps was put in place, the plane started to stabilize more. When they realized this, the pilots tried to lower the flaps one more level, but the shaking had increased. The stability had deteriorated. They immediately put the flaps back up and continued on the first stage. There was complete chaos on the plane. The pilots had no idea what was happening to the passengers in the back. Cables were flying around and items spilled from the shelves. The captain pilot was now faced with another problem. The hydraulic fluid in the plane had started to drain. Hydraulics are vital for controlling the plane's surfaces. The pilots had to land as soon as possible as it was becoming more difficult for them to control the plane every second and the plane was under great stress. The captain was afraid of losing vital controls. They were approaching faster than they should have been because the plane's shaking increased at low speeds. He decided not to take the plane below 170 knots. They immediately tried to lower the landing gear. While the main landing gear appeared to be down and locked, the light indicating the status of the nose landing gear was not illuminated. Failure to deploy the front landing gear meant that the already damaged aircraft would disintegrate upon first contact with the ground. The pilots also tried to manually lower the landing gear, but the indicator light, which should have been green, never came on. The pilots contacted the tower again and said that the crew on the ground should be prepared for anything, that they would not have nose landing gear and would need all the equipment they had. The captain had to make a critical decision at this stage. Should he first find out the position of the landing gear or should he try to land directly? Procedurally, he should have flown over the tower first to find out the position of the landing gear from the tower and try to deploy the landing gear again if necessary. But there was a huge hole in the airplane. As it was getting more and more difficult for them to hold in the air every second, the captain decided to land directly. The captain asked his co-pilot what their descent speed should be at a 5-degree flap angle. The co-pilot opened the relevant section of the flight manual and said that their descent speed should be 152 knots, taking into account their current weight and other parameters. But at low speeds, the vibrations in the aircraft increased and became difficult to control. This was not a situation that the pilots had been trained for. They were flying under really difficult conditions. Search and rescue teams had observed the plane and the condition of the landing gear and reported to the pilots that the landing gear was clear. The pilots were somewhat relieved. 12 minutes after the explosion, some of the passengers were sure that they would not survive and held hands. The first seconds after landing were very important. Would the damaged plane be blown to pieces by the impact? The pilots were on final approach and landed hard on runway 02 at Kahului Airport in Maui because they were approaching faster than normal. The pilots completed their emergency landing and were able to stop on the runway. As a result of the accident, 94 of the 95 people on board survived. Only 58-year-old veteran flight attendant Clarabelle was pulled out of the plane due to the pressure differential on board. Search and rescue operations began in the area where the crash occurred, both to find the piece of debris from the plane and to find the body of the cabin crew member. But the piece of wreckage and the 58-year-old cabin crew member were never found. The severity of the crash can be seen in this video. As soon as the plane landed, crews began evacuating passengers. Injured passengers were waiting for help inside the plane. 7 passengers were seriously injured. For 13 minutes, it was miraculous that the plane flew like this without a roof. The fact that there were so few casualties in this incident was due to the seat belts worn by the passengers and pilots. Otherwise, this number could have been much higher. The airport, which was constantly windy during the landing phase, was interestingly calm in the minutes they landed. This made it easier for the pilots to land. The U.S. National Transportation Safety Board began investigating the accident and its cause. These Boeing 737s were designed for 20 years of service and 75,000 flights. Although the airplane was 19 years old, it had already passed 75,000 flights. Airplanes are pressurized as they gain altitude. This causes the airframe to expand and stretch. The airframe, which is constantly expanding and contracting, experiences metal fatigue over time. Airplanes that are constantly gaining and losing altitude due to short-haul flights in the region suffer more damage than other airplanes. Hawaii's humid air was another factor contributing to the fatigue and corrosion of the metals. For the researchers to reach a clearer conclusion, the severed piece had to be found. But the severed piece was never recovered from the deep Pacific. So a piece was taken from the remaining wreckage and taken to laboratories to be examined. The cracks were caused by an adhesive called epoxy, which was used to join 2 airplane parts together. Boeing had said the adhesive had to be applied at a certain temperature, but the company had used it at ambient temperature. The airline was highly criticized in the media for poor maintenance. The airline missed these small damages because they did not inspect the planes during daylight hours, but checked the planes at night in poorly lit conditions. As a result, the accident was caused by metal fatigue. The investigation determined that the inspection and maintenance procedures were inadequate and of poor quality. Boeing introduced regulations for aircraft produced in the same period to prevent the accident from happening again. This accident led to many regulations by revealing how old aircraft suffer from metal fatigue. After the crash, the captain and first officer returned to the flight line and continued to fly. A memorial was built at Honolulu Airport for the missing cabin crew chief. In memory of the 58-year-old cabin crew chief CB who lost her life in the crash,